Stop scrolling right now because what you are about to witness in this room will completely shatter the way you look at every single ordinary person you pass on the street. Before he could even utter a single syllable to introduce his background, his resume was violently torn into pieces and thrown directly at his scuffed shoes. She looked him dead in the eye with supreme corporate disgust and told him he belonged on the dangerous city streets cleaning up trash, completely unaware that this very young man legally owned the entire multi-billion-dollar skyscraper she was sitting in. When destiny decides to change its course, the grand castles of human pride turn into worthless dust within seconds. In the absolute heart of the modern metropolis, where massive glass skyscrapers pierce the corporate clouds and billions of dollars change hands in milliseconds, appearance is considered the ultimate truth. People in this ruthless corporate world spend thousands of dollars on tailored suits, gold watches, and expensive silk ties, completely forgetting that a person's true worth lies within their character, not their premium wardrobe. Every single morning, the grand corporate headquarters of the world's largest tech empire conducted hundreds of elite job interviews, hunting only for the most polished high-society professionals who could fit into their cold, clinical system. The morning sun usually painted the massive glass structures of the city in brilliant gold, but today a heavy, thick layer of gray rain clouds hung low over the financial district, matching the cold, unforgiving nature of the corporate machine below. The rain beat down continuously against the reinforced glass paneling of the monolithic tower, creating a steady, rhythmic background hum that seemed to mimic a ticking clock counting down to a grand moment of judgment. Inside the main atrium, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive French perfumes, premium leather briefcases, and the sharp, clinical smell of high-end floor polish. Dozens of hopeful applicants paced back and forth across the mirrored white marble floors, their eyes nervously darting toward the security turnstiles and the glowing digital directory boards. They were all checking their reflections in the glass windows, fixing their perfectly ironed cuffs, straightening their luxury designer ties, and practicing their corporate smiles in a desperate attempt to look flawless. But on this specific rainy Monday, the rules of the game were about to change forever as a young man named Ethan walked through the front doors. Ethan was not an ordinary applicant. He was the only son and sole heir to the entire multi-billion-dollar corporate empire, but today he was completely undercover. He could have arrived in the most expensive luxury sports car surrounded by a team of elite private bodyguards, but he chose to leave his wealth behind, stepping onto a crowded public transit subway car early in the morning to experience the raw, unedited reality of the common working class. He purposefully dressed in a heavily faded, oversized denim jacket, a plain gray t-shirt and old slightly scuffed sneakers that he had pulled from the absolute back of his luxury closet. His powerful billionaire father had challenged him to test the true human values of their company's hiring department to see if success had made their senior managers arrogant, detached, and cruel to those who lacked wealth. Ethan walked past the massive high-security turnstiles, his simple appearance instantly drawing the suspicious eyes of the security guards who held their hands near their badges. He walked completely unfazed, holding a simple, cheap manila folder that contained an intentionally basic, entry-level resume document with a fake name and a completely ordinary background history. He took a seat quietly in the absolute furthest corner of the crowded human resources lobby, sitting perfectly still on a sleek black leather sofa that felt cold against his simple clothes. All around him, other candidates in premium luxury business suits glanced over at him with visible discomfort, subtly shifting their bodies away on the leather benches as if his apparent poverty was a contagious disease that could ruin their chances of success. People were looking at him with deep judgment, murmuring behind their clipboards, their eyes scanning his scuffed shoes and faded denim with a look of pure high-society corporate contempt. They adjusted their expensive coats, whispered cruel jokes to each other, and laughed quietly under their breath, completely ignoring his presence as a living, breathing human being. Ethan simply adjusted his posture, maintaining absolute composure, a deep, steady breath and a calm, knowing smile, entirely unfazed by the judgmental whispers echoing across the cold marble floor. He watched silently as the clock on the wall ticked closer to his scheduled time, preparing himself mentally for whatever toxic treatment lay behind the executive doors, knowing that true power never needs to scream for attention. The heavy mahogany doors at the end of the hall remained shut tight, but the psychological battle had already begun in the minds of everyone present. Ethan took a slow, deep breath, feeling the textured paper of his fake resume beneath his fingertips, fully aware that within the next few hours, the entire power structure of this arrogant corporate tower would be completely turned upside down. He watched the rain stream down the massive glass panes, each drop reflecting the cold neon lights of the lobby, waiting patiently for the moment his name would be called into the lion's den. Behind the heavy, polished mahogany doors of the main executive interview room sat Victoria, the senior head of human resources, a woman notorious throughout the entire corporate landscape for her supreme, unyielding pride. Victoria had climbed the corporate ladder by being completely ruthless, treating the corporate world like a harsh battlefield where only the wealthy and well-connected deserved to survive. Over her long, aggressive career, she had mastered the toxic art of judging every single human being instantly by the price tag of their clothing, the luxury brand of their watch, and the prestige of their family name. For her, human values, empathy, and genuine dedication meant absolutely nothing if they were not backed up by a massive bank account and high society connections. She firmly believed that wealth was the only true metric of human intelligence, and she treated anyone below her social status with absolute, freezing contempt, viewing them as mere statistics beneath her feet. Her office was a true masterpiece of cold, minimalist luxury design, carefully crafted to make anyone who entered feel incredibly small, weak, and powerless. The room was filled with rare high-end designer art pieces, custom-made dark wood furniture imported from Europe, and a massive panoramic window that offered a sweeping, intimidating view of the sprawling city skyline below. She sat comfortably behind her immense polished mahogany desk, her fingers typing rapidly on a sleek, high-tech computer screen while she reviewed the profiles of the wealthy candidates waiting outside. She looked out of her large, pristine glass office window, her sharp, hawk-like eyes immediately locking onto Ethan's faded, oversized denim jacket sitting peacefully in the furthest corner of the waiting area. Her face contorted into a highly judgmental, arrogant sneer as she let out a heavy sigh of deep annoyance, disgusted that such a poorly dressed person had even bypassed building security and entered her premium space. She picked up her glowing office intercom telephone, her voice sharp, demanding, and dripping with condescension as she ordered the receptionist to send the poorly dressed intruder in next. Ethan stood up smoothly as his undercover alias name was called, gripping his basic manila folder with absolute, unshakable confidence as he stepped away from the sofa. He walked with a steady, graceful stride that did not match his cheap clothes, showing absolutely no signs of nervousness or intimidation as he approached the grand entrance of the inner office. He gently pushed open the heavy wooden door, stepping into the massive, minimalist luxury office that smelled of expensive leather, rich mahogany wood, and global corporate power. There was a terrifying, suffocating silence in that room, a heavy atmosphere designed specifically to crush the confidence of any normal person walking through the door. The sweeping view of the city skyline behind Victoria's chair made her look like a queen ruling over a kingdom of glass, projecting supreme dominance over the common world. Ethan offered a polite, genuine, and professional smile, completely unaware of the highly toxic and cruel psychological trap that this woman had prepared for his arrival. Victoria sat high and proud in her premium leather executive chair, her arms crossed tightly over her expensive luxury blazer as she stared at the young man from head to toe with immediate visible disgust. As Ethan gracefully walked up to her massive desk, he politely extended his hand for a traditional, respectful professional greeting to start the meeting in a normal manner. Victoria completely ignored his extended hand, leaving him hanging in the cold air while she leaned back slowly in her chair, her eyes projecting supreme corporate superiority. She refused to shake his hand, considering even looking at a person of his apparent class a deep insult to her high position and her pristine corporate environment. She wanted him to feel small, unwanted, and entirely out of place before she even uttered a single word to him. She stared at him for several long, agonizing seconds, allowing the heavy silence of the room to build up a sense of intense intimidation, hoping to see him tremble under her powerful high-status gaze. But Ethan remained perfectly rooted to the ground, his eyes clear and entirely unbothered by her psychological games, waiting patiently for her to speak. The tension in the room grew thicker with every passing second, creating a cold battle of wills between arrogant corporate pride and hidden absolute power. Victoria leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as she prepared to unleash her verbal venom, completely unaware that this silent young man held her entire career and future in the palm of his hand. Ethan calmly lowered his hand without showing even a single hint of embarrassment, irritation, or emotional vulnerability, maintaining perfect, piercing eye contact with the arrogant interviewer. His serene gaze acted like a clear mirror, reflecting her own deep-seated insecurities back at her, which only fueled her growing internal agitation. Seeing that her silent psychological games were failing to crush his spirit or make him look down in shame, Victoria's professional mask completely slipped away, turning her annoyance into a sharp, bitter, and highly aggressive frustration. She pointed a sharp, perfectly manicured fingernail toward a lone, simple plastic chair placed far across the massive desk, commanding him to sit down immediately in a harsh tone that made him sound like an uninvited servant invading a sacred temple of wealth. The undercover billionaire's son sat down smoothly, moving with a relaxed, confident body language that completely defied his cheap attire and secretly infuriated the proud human resources manager even further. With a sudden, aggressive and highly disrespectful movement, Victoria reached across her pristine desk and snatched the cheap manila folder right out of his hands, looking down at the basic paper document with a mocking, cruel grin spread across her face. She tossed the document onto her desk carelessly, letting it slide against the polished wood without taking even a single second to read a single word of his background history, his qualifications, or the immense effort written upon the page. Did you honestly believe for a single second that a prestigious, multi-billion-dollar international conglomerate like ours would ever hire someone who looks like a literal beggar off the dangerous city streets? She asked loudly, her voice booming off the glass walls. Every single word coming out of her mouth was heavily dipped in toxic venom, purposefully aimed directly at destroying the young man's self-respect and crushing his human dignity in front of anyone who might be listening. She openly and loudly laughed at his ordinary background, aggressively questioning how someone wearing a faded denim jacket could even begin to comprehend the highly complex operations of a global financial empire. Her voice was dripping with deep, toxic disgust, echoing clearly through the silent room and reaching the ears of the nervous high society applicants who were still waiting outside in the main hallway, making them whisper in fear. Despite the heavy verbal assault, Ethan kept his composure perfectly, his breathing remaining entirely rhythmic and steady as he looked directly into her angry eyes. He leaned forward slightly and asked her in a gentle, calm voice if character, moral work ethic, and true dedication to the company's mission mattered more than luxury clothing brands in this grand firm. Victoria's eyes flashed with a sudden, explosive rage at his calm question, feeling deeply offended that a poorly dressed nobody dared to question her supreme corporate authority or challenge her elitist ideology. She stood up abruptly from her massive executive desk, towering over the sitting candidate like a dark shadow, and violently grabbed his physical resume paper with both hands. In one fluid, malicious motion, she ripped the paper right down the middle with a harsh, loud tearing sound that seemed to shatter the remaining silence of the boardroom. She tore the paper into two pieces and threw them directly into his face, crossing every single imaginable line of basic human decency, professional protocol, and corporate ethics. She watched with a sense of twisted satisfaction as the torn pieces of paper fluttered down through the air, landing softly onto the cold floor right near his scuffed sneakers. She let out a loud, mocking laugh that filled the entire executive suite, deeply enjoying every single bit of his public humiliation and basking in her own false sense of absolute dominance. She told him that his very presence in the room was a dirty insult to the company's elite image and that he should have known his place in society before knocking on their grand doors. She stood over him, her chest heaving with arrogant pride, fully expecting him to break down, cry, or beg for mercy on his knees, completely unaware that this very moment of maximum humiliation was the exact catalyst that would bring her entire world crashing down to the ground. She took a deep breath of satisfaction, firmly believing she had successfully asserted her absolute power over this defenseless intruder, completely blind to the fact that her pride had just sealed her fate. The torn papers lay scattered across the highly reflective corporate marble floor, reflecting the dim gray light from the stormy windows outside, but Ethan did not flinch, move, or show even a single flicker of fear. He simply looked down at the shredded pieces with a cold, calculated, and completely relaxed expression of absolute certainty. Victoria walked slowly and deliberately around her massive mahogany desk, her high heels clicking loudly against the hard floor like an ominous countdown, until she stood right next to his chair. She pointed her arm aggressively toward the main exit door, her face completely flushed a deep crimson color with uncontrolled, toxic corporate anger. People like you belong out on the dark city streets sweeping up trash for pennies, not sitting inside my beautiful, pristine executive boardroom trying to climb a corporate ladder you absolutely do not belong on, she shouted at the top of her lungs, letting her voice reverberate off the thick glass panels. She threatened to have him physically dragged out of the magnificent building by a team of elite security forces, crossing her arms tightly over her designer blazer as she continued to pour more malicious insults onto his character. She called him a complete and utter embarrassment to the professional world, telling him that no matter how hard he tried in life, his low financial appearance would always define his social status and keep him trapped at the very bottom of the food chain. She demanded that he get out of her sight immediately, threatening to blackball his name from every major financial institution in the country so he would never find an entry-level job again for as long as he lived. Ethan slowly and gracefully stood up from his simple plastic chair, his tall, powerful and naturally regal billionaire posture suddenly casting a long, highly intimidating shadow right over her small, trembling frame. He looked down at the furious human resources manager with a very mysterious and deeply knowing smile, stating softly that her immense pride and lack of basic human decency had just cost her absolutely everything she loved and worked for in life. Victoria laughed scoffingly, her judgment completely blinded by her false corporate pride and her high-ranking job title, and she reached her shaking hand toward the glowing desk phone to finalize her threat to call the building security guards to discard him. But right at that exact, critical microsecond, before her finger could even touch the digital keypad, the heavy, polished mahogany office door smoothly swung open wide with a sudden, commanding, and highly authoritative motion that demanded absolute attention. Stepping directly into the executive room was a powerful, legendary elderly billionaire, the absolute owner, ultimate founder, and supreme king of the entire global corporate empire. Dressed in a flawless, custom-tailored charcoal business suit woven from the finest fabrics, complemented by a brilliant silver silk tie and a polished gold lapel pin, the old man's magnificent, heavy presence instantly froze the entire room into an absolute, suffocating silence. His single entrance completely shifted the chaotic energy of the environment, changing it instantly from a place of petty corporate bullying into a grand court of final, absolute cosmic judgment. Victoria's hand froze entirely mid-air, her breath catching sharply in her dry throat as the phone receiver slipped completely from her weak grip, clattering loudly against the wooden desk in absolute, paralyzing shock upon recognizing the ultimate boss of her entire career standing right before her eyes. The air in the room grew entirely freezing, dropping in temperature within seconds, and the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to amplify significantly in volume as the legendary founder stepped fully into the luxurious space, his piercing, experienced eyes scanning the entire room. He looked down at the scattered pieces of white paper torn up on the pristine floor, and then he looked directly at Victoria, his face instantly hardening into an expression of unyielding, absolute authority and cold disappointment that signaled immediate, unmitigated danger for her future. The silence was so profound that the heavy sound of the rain outside seemed to fade into a distant whisper, leaving only the crushing weight of the old man's intense, judgmental gaze locking onto her trembling figure. Every bit of the arrogant posture she had displayed just seconds ago melted away into nothingness, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming dread that made her skin turn entirely pale. She stood there completely rooted to the spot, her heart hammering against her ribs, as she realized that the supreme ruler of the empire had just witnessed her explosive, unprofessional outburst in its entirety, and there was absolutely nowhere left for her to hide. The rude interviewer's angry face instantly transformed into a fake, overly submissive and deeply nervous smile as she rushed out from behind her massive mahogany desk, her high heels scrambling wildly against the floor to greet the supreme owner of the empire. "Sir, what an absolute, incredible honor it is to have you here in my department today. I am so incredibly sorry you had to witness such an unprofessional scene, but I was just in the middle of forcefully removing this completely worthless, poorly dressed intruder from our beautiful office premises before he could cause any real trouble or disrupt our elite workflow," she stammered frantically, her voice shaking violently and rising several octaves as her face turned completely pale with panic. She bowed her head repeatedly in a highly desperate, pathetic manner, her hands trembling as she tried to smooth down her luxury blazer, desperately hoping that the legendary billionaire wouldn't realize the extreme lack of human decency and sheer cruelty she had just displayed to a helpless applicant. The elderly billionaire, however, completely ignored her extended, shaking hand and her frantic, desperate wall of words, walking right past her shivering body with a stern, icy, and completely unyielding expression that made the blood freeze solid inside her veins. He did not look at her for even a single microsecond, treating her entire high-status existence like thin, invisible air as he kept his piercing eyes locked entirely on the corner of the room. He walked straight toward the undercover candidate, his hard, expensive leather footsteps echoing clearly and heavily through the silent, suffocating room like the slow, steady approach of a final, cosmic ultimate judgment. The very man before whom the entire international corporate world bowed down, the man who controlled massive global financial systems with a single signature, walked quietly, respectfully, and submissively toward the poorly dressed boy sitting calmly in the faded denim jacket. Victoria watched in complete, paralyzing and absolute horror as the top billionaire owner finally stopped directly in front of the young man, a warm, immensely proud, and deeply loving smile breaking across his stern face as he gently placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. "How was your very first secret undercover test of our corporate human resources department, my beloved son and sole heir to this empire?" the billionaire father asked out loud, his powerful voice carrying a brilliant, unmistakable tone of paternal affection that shattered the silence of the room like a heavy hammer. The terrifying, reality-crushing words hit Victoria's mind like a sudden, intensely painful lightning bolt from a pitch-black sky, completely shattering her perception of reality, destroying her fragile ego, and breaking her lifelong corporate pride into a million worthless pieces. The very ground beneath her feet seemed to vanish completely into a dark abyss as the terrifying truth became crystal clear to her frozen, panicked mind, leaving her completely breathless. She realized with an absolute sickening dread that the young man she had just insulted so brutally, the man whose face she had thrown papers at, and whose resume she had torn to pieces with her own hands, was the sole legal heir to absolutely everything she depended on for her survival, her status, and her livelihood. Ethan smoothly and calmly stood up from his chair, reaching down to remove his faded denim jacket and tossing it aside onto the couch, revealing a sharp, athletic, and commanding posture underneath that perfectly mirrored the natural royal authority of his legendary billionaire father. The owner's son turned his head slowly, looking directly and deeply into the wide, bloodshot eyes of the trembling interviewer, his voice now losing all of its previous gentle softness and carrying the undisputed, immensely heavy weight of the entire multi-billion-dollar global empire. Victoria's knees began to buckle violently beneath her weight as the absolute terror of her situation fully settled into her chest, realizing she had just publicly insulted, deeply humiliated, and aggressively tried to kick out the future king and supreme leader of the company. She stood there completely paralyzed, her mouth opening and closing repeatedly without a single sound coming out, her mind desperately and frantically trying to find a way to rewrite the last 10 minutes of her life, realizing with an overwhelming sense of ultimate doom that her high-flying corporate career, her elite reputation, and her entire life of luxury were now completely and irrevocably over. The silence in the room returned, heavier and colder than ever before, as the father and son stood side by side, their identical piercing gazes locking onto her ruined, trembling figure, waiting for the final execution of absolute corporate justice. In a state of pure, overwhelming, and utterly catastrophic desperation, the completely broken interviewer fell directly to her knees right on the freezing, hard marble floor, sobbing uncontrollably like a helpless, abandoned child who had just lost everything in a single moment. Her manicured fingers clawed frantically at the empty air, desperately reaching toward the young heir's scuffed sneakers as she begged for a drop of mercy, offering a million hollow, rushed apologies for the terrible, cruel, and unforgiving things she had spoken just moments ago. "Please, I beg of you, forgive me. I swear to you I didn't know who you were. I was only trying to protect the company's elite international image from outsiders who don't understand our corporate culture," she screamed through her thick, heavy tears, her voice cracking under the immense weight of her sudden terror. But when time has already passed and irreversible damage has been done to another human being's dignity, crying, weeping, and begging become completely useless, empty, and meaningless actions that fall on entirely deaf ears. She kept crying out, her knees sliding forward on the polished white floor, but her panicked tears could not wash away the deep, toxic malice and supreme arrogance she had proudly shown just minutes ago to a human being she falsely assumed was completely weak and defenseless. Some terrible, malicious mistakes in life can never be undone, and the universe never forgets a single bad deed committed against an innocent soul who cannot fight back. The legendary billionaire father stood completely tall and unmoving beside his powerful son, his face a magnificent, terrifying mask of absolute disappointment, cold anger, and severe, unyielding judgment that offered absolutely no room for negotiation, pity, or corporate compromise. Ethan looked down, his eyes focusing tightly on her trembling face, and calmly pointed a single finger down to the torn pieces of his basic resume scattered like worthless snow across the floor, stating in a clear, echoing voice that a senior leader who judges humanity solely by the price tag of their clothes is fundamentally and completely unfit to lead any department in this grand international firm. The old billionaire raised a single, commanding and authoritative hand in absolute silence, instantly cutting off the woman's loud, frantic crying with an undisputed power that shook the very walls of the executive suite. "You are officially, immediately fired from this entire international conglomerate, effective this exact second, without a single cent of severance pay, without your bonuses, and without any recommendation letter for your future employment," the father declared, his voice cutting through the room like a razor-sharp blade. Her immense, unchecked arrogance had officially become the exact and definitive reason for her sudden, painful and total destruction in the professional world she once ruled with an iron fist. Her massive high salary, her supreme high corporate status, and her beautiful custom-designed luxury office vanished into thin air within a matter of seconds, leaving her completely broke and exposed. The billionaire father turned slightly toward the entrance, gesturing with a sharp nod for two large uniformed security guards who had been waiting outside to enter the room immediately and remove the disgraced woman from the building. Victoria was forcefully but professionally lifted from the cold floor, her expensive luxury blazer now looking entirely hollow, cheap, and meaningless as her legs shook so violently she could barely stand on her own feet. She was marched directly out of the skyscraper in absolute, crushing public shame, her eyes fixed on the floor as she passed the long lines of other applicants who watched her downfall in stunned, breathless silence. She wept openly, her makeup smeared across her pale face, her hands covering her eyes as the heavy, inescapable realization of her total corporate execution crushed whatever tiny remaining bit of pride she had left in her soul, proving once and for all that those who build their lives on stepping on others will always fall the hardest when justice arrives. The Grand Executive Office was finally and completely cleansed of its toxic arrogance, leaving behind a peaceful, brilliantly bright and deeply welcoming atmosphere that smelled of fresh rich coffee, crisp autumn air, and a brand new era of righteous corporate leadership. Ethan, now fully stepping into his true identity, was dressed in a flawless, custom-tailored dark navy business suit that perfectly hugged his frame, completely replacing the faded denim jacket of his undercover past. He gracefully and confidently sat behind the massive, gleaming mahogany desk, officially taking his rightful place as the new supreme head of global human resources for the entire multi-billion-dollar empire. He looked up with a warm, genuinely supportive smile as the polite receptionist quietly walked into the quiet room, carrying a brand new manila folder filled with the applications of ordinary people who had previously been ignored. The very first applicant he welcomed into the redesigned boardroom was a young man dressed in very humble, cheap, and slightly oversized clothing, who was visibly shaking from head to toe with an intense, paralyzing nervousness about his uncertain financial future. The young applicant kept his eyes locked firmly onto the floor, fully expecting to be met with the same cold, ruthless judgment and bitter condescension that had defined this elite tower for so many years under the previous management. He clutched his simple papers tightly to his chest, his knuckles turning white as he braced himself for the inevitable sting of rejection. Seeing the absolute terror and deep vulnerability in the boy's eyes, the billionaire's son immediately stood up from his executive leather chair, walked slowly around the massive wooden desk, and extended his hand with a deep warmth and sincere humility. He gripped the poor candidate's hand firmly, shaking it with the utmost respect, dignity, and absolute equality, instantly shattering the heavy wall of fear that had consumed the quiet room for so long. Ethan looked the young man directly in the eyes and told him that his past, his background, and the price of his clothes would never define his worth inside these walls, bringing a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotional relief to the applicant's face. Ethan proved conclusively to the entire corporate world that true lasting wealth is never found in a massive bank account, a luxury designer label, or an expensive gold watch, but is found deeply rooted within a pure, honest, and hardworking human heart. He proved that in this brand new era of global leadership, genuine talent, raw dedication, and true humility would always be valued far above shallow luxury, high society family status, and false corporate pride. Across every single branch of the international company, a strict, unyielding new policy was officially established and written into law. No human being would ever be judged, evaluated, or mistreated based on their outward appearance, their financial background, or their social standing. The old, biased corporate metrics were completely discarded, replaced by a system that honored human work ethic above all else. Meanwhile, miles away from the gleaming glass towers of the financial district, inside a loud, dusty, and low-end local department store, the former senior human resources interviewer was now seen quietly folding stacks of cheap clothes for minimum wage. Wearing a stained, simple employee apron with heavy tears continuously welling up in her tired eyes, she finally and deeply understood the true agonizing pain of being treated like absolute dirt by someone in a position of power. She watched as wealthy, arrogant customers walked completely past her with the exact same judgmental, disgusted looks she used to give to others, learning the hardest and most painful lesson that karma could ever teach a proud soul. Every single day, as her hands grew rough from handling cheap fabric and cleaning dirty floors, she deeply regretted the cruelty she had unleashed upon the world, realizing too late that pride is a short-lived castle built entirely on sinking sand. She remembered the boy in the denim jacket and how easily she had dismissed his humanity, weeping silently as she realized her own actions had brought her to this rock bottom. Back at the grand corporate headquarters, the young billionaire stood tall and proud beside his legendary father, both of them framed perfectly by the massive glass window during a beautiful, sweeping sunset that painted the entire city skyline in shades of deep gold, crimson, and vibrant orange. They stood in silence, watching the city move below them like a vast ocean of human potential, knowing they had protected their legacy. True victory is never about destroying your enemies with loud anger or seeking bitter revenge. It is about letting your silent success, your unwavering kindness, and your absolute moral integrity make the loudest noise in the universe. True success only has meaning when your beautiful character speaks for you, and as the final golden rays of the sun dipped below the distant horizon, lighting up the world in a brilliant glow, Ethan knew that absolute justice had finally been served, and a righteous, completely fair and beautifully bright future had officially begun for every single person who dared to dream.